The human body is a vast collection of billions of cells living in an environment devoid of sensations. Through chemical and electrical processes, our perceptions and memories are formed in our brains. Each brain contains neurons, microscopic cells responsible for translating external stimuli such as light, heat, sound, and pressure into electrochemical signals that the organism can use to act. What might be surprising is that as neurons process these sensory signals, they create an edited version of reality, even at the most basic level. By competing with each other, neurons transform reality by retaining only the strongest signals and eliminating the weaker ones. Consequently, we decide to reject 99% of the world from the very first moment, quickly transforming reality into something our organism can use.
Susana Martinez-Conde, along with her partner and collaborator Stephen Macknik, are among the world's preeminent experts on illusions and perception and what they tell us about how the brain works.
Now what? To give a different example, Adelson's checkerboard illusion is so striking because you see some of the checks as dark and others as bright, but you realize that it is exactly the same shade of gray.
Don't believe it? Look at the squares labeled A and B. A looks darker, right? Wrong. That's the illusion. That's because your brain is adjusting for the shadow.
What's happening is that your brain is considering the light source and basically subtracting that light source from your resulting perception.
What you need to understand is that we really can't see most of the world around us. We're effectively blind to 99.9% of the world around us at any given time. If you hold out your thumb at arm's length and you straighten your elbow and you look at your thumbnail is about 1 degree of visual angle here. And it turns out that that's the only place we can actually see with 20/20 vision.
Wow.
And everywhere else we're legally blind.
It might sound hard to believe, but human vision is really like this. You actually only see detail in about 1% of your visual field. That's because only a tiny portion of the world can be processed in detail by the retina.
It feels like I'm seeing the whole world in 20/20 vision.
And it's almost all completely made up in your brain based on assumptions and models of how the world works and just a tiny bit of high quality visual information.
Here's how your brain really sees the world. It's easy to think it's like this. You open your eyes and the whole world pours in, but really it's like this. Your eyes sample tiny pieces of the world and the brain fills in the rest, constantly, all the time. Consider this. Your optic nerve is what connects your eye to your brain, and its location near the center of your retina effectively creates a blind spot near the center of your visual field. And yet, you don't experience the blind spot. Why? The brain samples the area near the blind spot and fills in the gap with its best guess. And most of the time, we all agree on that simulation. It's when we don't that we can learn something.
To understand color perception, I used Photoshop to place an image of a dress in various contexts, each rich in visual cues. From there, something interesting happened. In one of the scenes, the dress appeared white and gold to most viewers. However, the pixels that compose the image of the dress were identical to those in the original version. The visual context, such as the bluish tint of the skin, the blue light in the background, and the position in the shadow, influences how the brain interprets colors. Consequently, the brain tries to disregard some of the perceived blue light, rendering the dress as white and gold. When the visual elements are reversed, such as the skin-tinted yellow, a background with a yellow cast, and the dress illuminated rather than in shadow, the dress appears blue and black. Once again, the pixels remain identical, but the visual context completely transforms the perception of color. This phenomenon illustrates the power of context in shaping how the brain interprets light signals. This striking example demonstrates how colors are perceived in the brain. The question that then arises is, do we create color in our minds, or does it objectively exist in the world around us? What seems evident is that color perception is largely determined by how our brain interprets the context in which colors are presented.
Light illuminates the world and reflects off objects. It consists of different wavelengths, each corresponding to a distinct color. These wavelengths change when they encounter various surfaces: rough, smooth, wet, and so on. The signal that reaches your eye results from the reflective properties of the object and the specific wavelengths of light interacting with it. This light signal is focused onto the retina at the back of the eye, which contains approximately 130 million light-sensitive cells. 3 types of these cells, known as cones, are involved in color perception, each sensitive to long, medium, and short wavelengths of light. However, light alone is not yet perceived as color. For color to be perceived, the brain must interpret the 3-part code transmitted from the retina and use the relative responses of the cones to encode color. This signal then reaches an area of the brain called V4, where a neural representation of color emerges, corresponding to our perceptual experience.
That's because objects reflect different wavelengths into your eye depending on the lighting conditions. If your brain didn't compensate for this, a red berry would appear gray in a cave, blue at dawn, and orange at dusk. But instead, your brain carefully calibrates your experience to hold color constant. Dogs rely on smell, so they have fewer types of cones and thus see the world like this. Birds need to recognize tiny color differences from great distances, so they have an extra type of cone that allows them to see more colors than we do. And bees need to find flowers rich in nectar, so they see ultraviolet light that's invisible to us. So why do people see this image of the dress differently? It comes down to your brain's assumptions about the lighting conditions. It seems that the more time you spend working indoors under artificial light, which is predominantly yellow, the more likely you are to say the dress is black and blue, because your brain assumes it is lit by artificial light and subtracts out the yellow. Conversely, if you spend more time in natural light, which is bluer, you're more likely to see it as white and gold.
It's like that stupid dress again, all over but in audio form.
This is not saying Laurel, this is only saying Annie.
Exactly! It's Laurel!
The divide stems from the fact that the audio file is an ambiguous signal made up of both high and low frequencies. But by manipulating the frequencies, I might be able to change what you hear. High.
Laurel.
Low.
Laurel. Laurel.
All of this goes to show how much the brain is an active interpreter of sensory input. Our perception of the external world is actually much less objective than we'd like to believe. To a certain extent, you see what you expect to see, a predicted path of motion. And this is what helps us hit a home run or flinch from a punch at just the right moment.
The brain is using sensory information to calibrate, update, to fine-tune these predictions so they remain tied to reality in ways that are not constrained by accuracy, but that are constrained by how useful the brain's perceptual predictions are in the business of staying alive.
You see, so they're alternating cold, warm, cold, warm.
Mm-hmm. Ow!
Right? Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, what is going on there? It sort of feels cold at first, but then
it gets this kind of burning sensation, right?
Yes, very much so. It feels super hot, like I'm getting burnt. In your hands, you have separate sensors for heat, cold, and pain. Normally, when you touch something slightly cold, both your cold and pain sensors are activated, but the cold ones override the signals from the pain sensors, telling your brain there's nothing to worry about. Unless, in this very unnatural scenario with the thermal grill, you happen to be touching something warm at the same time. Here, the heat signals cancel out the cold ones, leaving you with just the pain ones activated, telling your brain, ouch! Pain, not unlike the experience of color, is a construct of the mind.
Pain is a very important learning mechanism for children. They learn what behaviors they can engage in that are safe and what behaviors they should not engage in because they could cause them bodily harm. And there's different mutations that people can have in certain proteins that make them completely insensitive to pain. And so kids do things like bite on their lips or on their fingers when they're very young, and as they get older can engage in risky behavior.
So most people think of the brain reconstructing the world more or less verbatim, but that's just not true. What it's actually doing is it's getting very little information, and it's using that very little information to make a big, grand model of the world. And that simulation of the world is what we call consciousness.
Consciousness. We take it for granted, but every time you wake up, your brain stitches together all your sensory inputs. The sound of a distant train, the smell of coffee, the warmth of the sun, into an experience of the world. And that experience, that awareness of the world, is what scientists call consciousness.
A powerful example of this is the phenomenon of blind sight.
The stroke damaged a piece of the brain devoted to vision, leaving her with an apparent total blind spot.
When that target pops up in my blind area, I don't see it. Left.
Strangely, even though she says she doesn't see anything in the blind spot, she gets it right more often than not.
Right.
Even if they say I didn't see anything, but you tell them, please just tell me whether you saw it or not, then the response would be above chance.
Information is getting in, affecting our behavior and how we're responding to the world around us without there being a conscious perception of that piece of visual information.
Correct. While you're just sitting here, your brain is using up about 20% of all the calories that you have. So it's using up quite a bit. But if you think about a 2-year-old, his brain is using 60% of his calories. So almost all that food is just going to keep his brain going.
To understand why young brains might need so much more fuel, check out the connections in a toddler's brain versus an adult's. A 2-year-old's brain has about 2 quadrillion synapses. By the time they hit adulthood, that number is cut in half. As we age, in the interest of efficiency, we strengthen the connections that are useful to us and prune the rest.
We see this early brain that's very exploratory, that has lots and lots of potential, lots of possibilities. Not very good at putting on your jacket and getting out to preschool in the morning. And then we have this later brain that's very good at doing things, not so good at changing, not so good at taking in new information, not so good at doing something new.
You flash a word so quickly that the person cannot see it and claims, there was no word. However, fMRI scans reveal activation in the visual cortex even when nothing is perceived. The key is identifying the threshold timing where the image is sometimes consciously seen. Extending the word's duration makes it clearly visible, demonstrating an all or none phenomenon. Either you see it or you don't. This provides a powerful window into the neural correlates of conscious perception. When perception occurs, multiple brain regions show a surge in activity. The parietal cortex, sensory integration, the anterior cingulate, drive and decision-making, and the prefrontal cortex, reasoning and higher order cognition.
According to some experts, this communication between brain regions is the signature of consciousness. All neurons, when poked by a magnet, will kick back an electrical signal that looks like this, a brainwave. But if the surrounding neurons aren't healthy, those brainwaves won't get very far. It turns out that in conscious people, even those who appear unresponsive, not only do those brainwaves spread all over the brain, but they become more complex too. It's as if, to use music as the analogy, what starts as a single repeated note by a few neurons eventually turns into a coordinated symphony of millions. Studies of hundreds of patients in various states, from deep sleep to anesthesia to coma, have enabled scientists to develop a complexity scale. A score above a certain threshold means you're conscious or have the capacity for consciousness. I know my brain creates an internal experience by knitting together bits of sensory information, filling in the gaps with its best guess of what's out there in the world. But what are those guesses based on? Memory. Each of us has a life rich with experiences to draw from. Where we were born, went to school, who we fell in love with. Memories are the cornerstone of our identities. But as it turns out, they have a very shaky foundation.
The stories we tell ourselves or what we consider our memory is a construction. We create these representations, and they're very dynamic. They constantly change. You're kind of living a revision of the story of your life constantly.
In 2000, memory scientist Eric Kandel won the Nobel Prize for showing that each memory creates new synapses, connections that store the memory. But what happens when you recall it?
Every time you remember it, you bring it up into your working memory and you perceive it, and you destroy the long-term memory. And you actually have to recast it into long-term memory when you re-remember it. So every single time you remember something, you actually add more noise to it so that it's more and more and more false throughout time.
This mechanism, called reconsolidation, was first discovered in rodents, where neuroscientists witnessed what happens when a memory gets recollected. For the memory to return to long-term storage, the connections between neurons actually have to get rebuilt. Just like our perceptions, our sense of self is dynamic, built to serve us in the present.
Our experience of self is a construction at all sorts of different levels. What the brain is doing, is interested in, is weaving together a kind of story.
The brain is a storytelling machine, right? It's a machine that's designed to make predictions.
The narratives that we tell ourselves are the biggest illusions that we ever participate in.
Your sense of who you are is an illusion, as everything else. You're no exception.
But even if our sense of self is an illusion, where does that leave us?
Trust the illusion. That's the only thing that we can be sure of, that what we perceive is not what's there.
I've learned that my brain is an exquisite machine that perceives reality in the service of survival, not accuracy. The world I carry inside of my head is a construction of my brain, built on bits of sensory information woven together with memory to create a conscious experience.